apologetics. What we're studying, it's all Jesus Christ. And fearlessness has nothing to do with me. Nothing. When he says, in this world you have tribulation, be of good cheer. Why?
I've overdone it.
Right. He doesn't say be of good cheer because if you work real hard, you can be fearless and attack the enemy. That's not what he says. He says, because I have overcome it. How did he overcome it?
By his death and burial and resurrection.
Okay, she says death, burial, and resurrection. She's crazy. She's crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. Does that make sense to anyone?
Yes.
Who said yes?
The guy sitting next to me.
Okay, why? Why does it make sense that he's overcome the world by his death, burial, and resurrection?
It's the one thing that sets him apart.
You already
Nobody
answered,
else
so I'm
ever
not
died.
interested in hearing from you again. Okay. No, she's. Come on, guys. Come on. This is what's going to happen to you in the world when you go out at the water cooler at work, when you're talking to people outside of church. Why do you think his death, burial, and resurrection have overcome this world?
Because he's the only perfect sacrifice.
Okay. Christianese answer.
What
Right?
else do you want? It's a Christian question.
Well, no, think about how you're talking to a non-believer. How has Jesus' death overcome this world?
He's overcome Satan. He's won.
Okay.
Satan lost. He died first.
Okay. What do we spend most people spend all their time doing? What do most of us do? We try to justify ourselves and the things we go through and our difficulties, and really, without admitting it, most of the guilt we carry, don't we? Everybody does. We're always, these arguments, this polarization in this country, when you listen to it, there is no way it feels like anybody's going to be able to come together on a common line. So what has Christ overcome? That very thing, right? Now, his death, what has it done though? What has it actually done? If you remember the story in the Bible, what happens is the Father says that he now has closed any means of entry to knowing him. It's not possible to know him personally. Why?
Nobody's perfect.
Good one that opened the door.
Yeah, let's go back to Genesis though. What happened that caused that separation?
Sin.
Sin.
Right, so the Garden of Eden, what happened is God said because of something about him as a person, people are now no longer allowed to commune with him or know him. What is it about him that caused that?
He's holy.
It's holiness. Right? What is holiness? Holiness literally in the Bible is separation. It's a term, kadosh, that means he separates himself from everything else, not from sin even, from very beginning, based on who he is. And what he does is he separates people to him for him, right? So the world was created for him. So what happens is people now are not able to commune with him, not because he doesn't love them, because he has, in the essence of who he is, he refuses to compromise it. He's not going to become less holy in order for us to have a relationship with him. He draws a line. This is why people hate the God of the Bible. He will not compromise himself so that you can know him. So what he does is he says the only way that someone can know him is if what they've done has been reconciled. It's just like a business. When you're taking a statement and you're short cash or money and you got to find a way to balance the figures, to bring them together. So literally what happens is God, the Father, it's the Father who puts this together, this plan from eternity on how to balance things together so that now he can have a relationship with you again. So his death, burial, and resurrection is that plan that was devised before eternity, so that now a holy God is able to commune with sinful people. So, death and burial. But who raised Jesus Christ? Did he raise himself from the grave? Who raised him?
God did.
God who?
The Father.
Why did he raise him?
That's
not bad. Why?
For our justification. Sanctification.
He did it to vindicate Christ. He did it to vindicate who his son is. Right? Literally what he said was, Romans chapter 3, I'll demonstrate my righteousness by taking my propitiation, my son, my mercy seat, who's sinless, and have him hang on a cross and die for you. And then I'll show why I'm right. That's what he means by demonstrate my righteousness. Why I'm right to say that if you don't cling to my son, you can't know me, by raising him from the dead. So the resurrection is actually the proof by the Father that he's right. That's intense. That's intense. And we forget this stuff in American culture. We don't realize what's going on here. You've got something. It's not just he rose from the dead because he loves us. It's because the Father, remember what he said in John chapter 1, when Jesus is being baptized underwater? This is my son in whom I am well pleased. So what's baptism? What happens when you go underwater? Death. Death. When Jesus Christ goes underwater, you know what the Father's saying? I love my son because he's showing everyone he's about to die. He's willing to die. And Jesus said to John the Baptist, let it be so we can fulfill all righteousness, what is right. So the Father is pleased because the Son is showing everybody there that he's baptizing himself to death. And he becomes a bondservant or slave to the Father for 3 years before he hangs on a tree. And the Father loves it, and he's pleased because he knows that by doing that, now he, one day, can be reconciled to anyone because of what his son does. I think this is, not only is it incredible, but the process, the method makes total sense. Nobody can die for another person unless that person who died for the other person is worthy of doing that. Otherwise, it's just another death here in the ground. Does this make sense? What does this have to do with irreducible complexity? Well, what we're doing now is, we're demonstrating, we're going to show with more information why God has to exist, and then we move towards the God of the Bible by today looking at blood. What's the big deal about blood? You don't love it. Okay, ready? So, arguments. We're in class 14. The arguments for God that we're talking about. We've been going through all of these. We're up to now irreducible complexity. Then we're going to finish off with the last 3. So now let's pick up where we were last week. We're still in Psalm 139, but now we're going to start looking at a couple of these proofs for irreducible complexity. And we're going to watch a few videos, okay? Your eye, the human eye. One of the things we're going to see in this class is we're studying literally right out of the Lee Summit High School textbooks. We're pulling right out of the textbooks in advanced biology class how they teach the evolution of the eye as proof of Darwinian evolution. All right? So we're taking that and showing you what they do, and then we're comparing it to this, which they're not teaching in school and they should be, because this is intense. Here we're starting, if you're in your book, we're on lesson 5.1, and we're getting ready to look now at Psalm 49, verse 9, which says, he who planted The ear shall he not hear. He that formed the eye shall he not see. Right? So what God's saying there is, I'm the one who made the eye. I created it, so don't you think I can see everything you do? Okay, so here we go. We look at the human eye. The human eye is actually more complicated. It's like a brain. It's more complicated than any other, if you call it an organ, if you will, in your body. It's processing information on your retina in the back of your eye. George Marshall said this. He said, it's the most complicated tissue in the whole body. Millions of nerve cells interconnect in a fantastic number of ways to form a miniature brain. We actually don't see with our eyes. I don't know how many of you guys know that. You don't see with your eyes. You see with your brain. Your eye is just taking information, starting with photons, and transferring them into an electrical signal that goes in your optic nerve to your brain. So your brain is the one that allows you to see. Okay? Okay, here we go. This is a part that if you ever learn this, I know it's in your book, I know it's a lot, but if you were to try to do this, to just share with anyone who's a non-believer, there's no answer for this. All right, your eye, when Darwin came up with the whole idea of the human eye as a evolutionary adaptation, they didn't know anything about biochemistry. They didn't know anything about how an eye actually functions. All they knew is the anatomy or structure. Here's how you actually see your eye. A photon of light strikes the retina and changes the shape of a proton called 11 CTS retinol, which then changes the shape of another proton called rhodopsin. When that happens, you get a new molecule, a new proton called metarhodopsin 2. So literally, you've got 11 CTS retinol floating around in your retina in the back of your membrane, just hanging out, and rhodopsin is completely separate, just hanging out doing nothing. But the minute a photon light hits 11 CTS retinol, it actually activates rhodopsin to do something. When it activates rhodopsin to do something, 11 CTS retinol and rhodopsin come together and they form metarhodopsin 2, a large molecule combined together, and their shape changes. I had a debate with an atheist on this because they were trying to debate eye function by looking at anatomy, and I was explaining this to them. It's a lock and key mechanism. It's an actual equation, a transfer function. In other words, 11 CTS retinol now triggers or activates rhodopsin to do something. Until that happens, rhodopsin's not doing anything. So you have to have these two happening together. But what's even crazier than that is metarhodopsin 2 sticks now to a protein called transducin. Before it bumped into metarhodopsin 2, transducin was bound to GDP. So when metarhodopsin 2 is formed by 11 CTS retinol and rhodopsin, it now triggers transducin to go ahead and drop GDP, so now transducin can stick to metarhodopsin 2. Before then, GDP and transducin were together, floating around. Then what happens is when GDP detaches from transducin, GTP that's floating around now is activated to bind to metarhodopsin 2, which now has GDP after it loses transducin. So GTP now binds to it. You got a multi-molecule. You got GTP, transducin, metarhodopsin 2. When that happens, you have another protein floating around there doing nothing called phosphodiesterase. And now all of a sudden, phosphodiesterase is activated, and now it binds. Until then, it's just floating around. When that happens, then phosphodiesterase, only when it's binding with metarhodopsin 2 and GDP, only when that happens, it now triggers cGMP, another protein molecule, to have its concentration lower in the cell. Until then, it's not being lowered. So then when it's lowered, what happens is another protein, the ion channel, is triggered because of cGMP's drop in its concentration to now close. And when it closes, another protein known as sodium ion channel now begins to drop. Now I want you to keep in mind, this all has to be together in one equation. You can't add a piece of this later. If any of this is missing, you don't see. This has to be there all at the same time.
Instantly.
This is crazy. What happens then is, when the sodium ion level drops, you get an imbalance in charge across the cell membrane, which creates an electric current. The electric current goes to the optic nerve to your brain, and you can see.
Wow.
So, if you're missing transducin, if it doesn't act, you don't see. If you have GDP not falling off a transducin, you don't see. If phosphodiesterase doesn't get triggered to go ahead and bind to the molecule after GDP falls off, you don't see. This can't be successive small changes over time. This has to be all there at the same time.
Does that happen the same way if somebody's colorblind?
Well, now you have aberrations, right? Now you have different aberrations or illnesses or diseases. But yes, you have the exact same process, but it's not perfect. You get aberrations. So in life, every process that operates has aberrations, has things go wrong. What do you call those? Special cause, right? Someone's born with a special cause, something went wrong, right? That is not the norm. This is 99% of everybody. This is exactly how it operates. You know, nobody can explain this using Darwinian evolution. All that vision is the brain's interpretation of the electrical signal that comes to you from your optic nerve that begins with a photon of light hitting 11 CTS retinal. Your brain's interpreting that signal. Here's what Michael Behe said. Darwin didn't even try to explain where his starting point, the relatively simple light-sensitive spot, came from. How the eye works, that is, what happens when a photon of light first hits the retina, simply couldn't be answered. To Darwin, vision was a black box. Now that the black box has been opened, it's no longer enough for an evolutionary explanation of that power to consider only the anatomical structures of eyes. That's what they still do in textbooks in school, is they stick to the anatomy, the structure. Nobody ever teaches this in high school, because they know if they do, what are they going to do?
They have to explain where it comes from.
They're going to have to try to explain why it operates this way. Each of the anatomical structures and steps that Darwin thought were so simple involved staggering, complicated biochemical processes that can't be papered over with rhetoric. We were in the first open forum we did here at church was in, I think, 2003. Maybe it was a little later. I can't remember now. It was Phil and I on stage. And we were talking about creation. And I had went on the website and invited local atheist groups to come. So we had all these people in the audience. And we asked them afterwards, you guys want to go in a separate room and have a discussion? So we had maybe 100 people in there, right? And we had probably like 15 different people from Kansas City Atheist Coalition. And I was surprised. One of the kids who's actually an atheist, not part of that group though, believe it or not, he was an atheist who went to our church sometimes, asked Phil a question. How do you explain the blind spot in an eye? If God is such a perfect God, why would he design the eye with a blind spot? Okay, so how would you answer that?
He created you.
Huh?
He created him.
It's definitely true. What would you say? Anybody else? The answer Phil gave was because of sin. Okay? Now, how do you think the atheist felt about that? Typical Christian, you know, using the sin as an excuse for everything. I mean, we all know that makes sense, but that kind of argument is difficult, isn't it, in an environment? So I raised my hand. I said, I got a question for you. I said, have you ever been in a museum and you see a structure and you look at it and you go, boy, isn't that neat? It's a whale in a surf. And then you look at the artist rendering it, it's a mother holding a child. So what you say to yourself is, well, I can't explain that, so the artist doesn't exist. Right? There must not be an artist because it doesn't make sense to me. I said, what's the big deal? So what? God decides to have a blind spot in the back of the eye, so? Yeah. I said, then I turned to him on this. I said, so do me a favor. Can you explain to me how 11-CTS retinol can take rhodopsin and create metarrhodopsin 2, translate it into GTP, GDP falls off, we get transducin, then it's phosphodiesterase, and I went through this one. Of course, no answer. This is so, don't worry. People are going to hit you with these crazy, silly accusations against God. The purpose of the book, the purpose of the material is so that you're strengthened, so that you know these people are actually mocking God. They're saying these things they're not thinking. Does that make sense? So here we have an irreducible complex biochemical system. And I cannot see anything unless all these parts are there at the same time. You can't have anything missing. So let's take a look how it works. I kind of made a graphic here to make it easier. We have 11-CTS retinol binds to rhodopsin when a photon of light hits it, and it creates, because it changes shape, rhodopsin to change shape, which becomes metarrhodopsin 2. So the two of them become a new protein. When that happens, transducin, which wasn't attached before, now comes over and attaches. When it comes over and attaches, GDP, which was attached to it, drops off. When GDP drops off, GTP jumps on, whereas before it wasn't. When GTP jumps on, phosphodiesterase comes over and jumps on. When phosphodiesterase comes over and jumps on, all of a sudden, cGMP is triggered now to lower its concentration in the cell. When it's triggered to lower its concentration, the protein sodium ion channel is triggered to lower its concentration. When it lowers its concentration, it creates an ion imbalance, which creates an electric charge. That electric charge now sends the current to the brain, so you see.
Like a battery.
Is that not crazy? So, this happens billions of seconds, nonstop, all day long. This is right now happening.
Right now.
The only reason I know your shirt is green is because a photon of light is hitting my eye and processing in a billionth of a second, so I know it's green. This is what's happening. As I look around the room, that's what's happening with you guys. So, you ready? Basically, that's it. It's something like that. It goes that fast. And it's happening constantly, all the time. And we've only talked about eye right now, okay? You have the olfactory nerve when you smell, right? You have the auditory nerve when you hear. You have your taste buds in your mouth when you taste. All of these are going on channels to your brain, and your brain is processing all of this billions of seconds constantly. This guy's, I mean, when David says in Psalm 139, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, all you got to do is study biochemistry and you go, oh, this is insane. Here's Richard Swenson. To simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times, and take several minutes of processing on a Cray supercomputer just to do what your eye's doing. Keeping in mind there are 10 billion or more cells interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. Wow. We're talking about a God who is just like, this is why we say he's beyond me. I just can't understand him. So when you have non-believers challenging you saying, well, who made God? Or, how come you can't explain God? Say, you kidding me? Who can? I mean, he is so beyond me that if he didn't become a person and come to earth to reveal himself and show who he is, we wouldn't have a chance.
And we can't get computers even to run that fast, as that happens.
Absolutely right. It doesn't even exist.
No. I mean, we're just now touching on quantum computers, and they can barely even understand it.
So the beauty of that, though, is when we start out with, back when we were kids and you're playing, what was that called? It's not Nintendo. Yeah, Pong, right?
Yeah.
And now look at where we are today. How did we get from there to here? What did it take? The evolution.
Information, adding
Design,
information. Yep.
intelligence,
Yep.
right? And yet we had this from the very beginning. So I love to say this all the time. Did any wisdom literature tell me God created the eye? Because this class, we need to do something. We need to elevate the Bible, again, as the greatest book ever written, not just because it's a great book, but because it deserves that. It's from God himself to us. So we constantly need to link these things together. When he says this, right, this is by the way, something that is a little irritating about God. Wouldn't you wish there was a chapter in Psalms that says, and here's how the retina works. Now, when 11 CTS retinal is hit with a photon of light, if he actually went through and explained that, we'd go, okay. Why doesn't he do that?
People at the time had no concept of those concepts. They couldn't wrap their mind around it.
Yeah, but look at David
You still can't wrap
in
your
1000
mind around it.
BC talking about crucifixion. Didn't even exist yet, right? We have a lot of examples in the Old Testament of things that the prophets talked about that hadn't even been invented yet. Why wouldn't God just put in there, let me explain to you how the eye works for our benefit?
Is this not the point of these trying?
What are you thinking? What's the point? What is he doing?
Showing, he's teaching everybody or showing everybody that he's trusted, that trust. Yeah.
I think so. I think what he does over and over again is he says, okay, I'm giving you plenty of evidences, because there are. I give you plenty of things you can look at. You don't believe me anyways, so I'm just going to tell you the way it is, and you just trust me. Genesis 1:1, right? Kind of annoying. In the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth. Why didn't he just say, in the beginning, there's a big explosion, and later you'll call it Big Bang, and here's how it really worked. Things didn't get more complex. They started that way with the four forces of the universe, and here's what they are. I mean, he doesn't do that. And yet, how did we find that out? How did we discover the four forces? How did we discover complexity in living things?
Because he says, those who seek me find me.
Yeah, so who saw it? Again, in book 1, when we went through it, I named for you over 30 of the greatest scientists who used the Bible as their starting point in order to discover all these things.
When you mentioned the blind spot in the eye, that whole going back there, those scientists would have taken that as a chance to go seek and find out why it's there.
Absolutely.
This generation now won't even try that.
No.
These is reason to disprove.
Right. But where is that coming from? How is that happening? We have, again, an education system that's training people on what to think. They're not training them to critically think. The Bible, people say, oh, you've been brainwashed. Well, there are parts of it, I'm glad I've been brainwashed, to be honest with you. I'm fine with that.
My brain needed washing.
Yeah, I need it. But the reality is, if you critically read the Bible and study it, you're going to get blown away over and over again as you find more and more things that he explains that you didn't know. So we have a generation that's being trained in our universities to believe what people say, to not think for themselves. Okay. So let's look at another one as an example of the eye. Here's another thing that's just amazing. Have you ever noticed that with most people, when you look, your eyes move together? How come they just, I mean, if you're watching like Men in Black, it's kind of cool. You got the aliens where their eyes are like all over the place. How come your eyes move together? You ever think about that? We take that for granted.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just move together. They move together almost perfectly. Why is that?
So you have depth. So you can see depth.
Mhm.
So because they're designed that way. You would think with Darwinian evolution, we'd have all kinds of instances of eyes that are doing all kinds of stuff, right? And you'd be able to see through history different improvements and incrementally in the eye's ability to function. Well, here's what it looks like. What you actually have is your eyeball is being held by muscles that are horizontal or lateral and vertical. And they're aligned perfectly. These muscles attached to tendons grab your white eyeball, and they're doing it from all directions. And by doing them from all directions, they go back to the orbit or the skull, and they attach so that they move in synchronous movement with both of them. So both eyes attach back and they move together. So you can, if you look up, you look down, if you look side to side, any angle, the muscles are all coordinated by signals coming from your brain, so you're able to look and move perfectly. What I mean by signals from your brain? How many people in here are over 20 years old? How were you able to raise your hand? How were you able to just raise your hand? We're going to look at Dr. Ben Carson go through an explanation of how a photon of light hits 11 CTS retinal and ends up making it so you can raise your hand. This is what's happening with your eyes and your muscles. It's because your brain that quickly sends signals that allows your body to move. And you know how we came up with cameras when you mount them on a tripod and their ability to move and rotate in unison. You know where we came up with that? Studying the human eye. Yep. And yet, we have yet to invent a camera that has the precision of movement as your eyes. It's just crazy. The 6 muscles that rotate an eyeball do it with enormous precision, directing visual axis exactly toward the object you're looking at. The complexity is amazing since we have 2 eyes and they have to work together, so it's not just one. There's a balance of pulls by all 6 of these rotary muscles that determine the direction of gaze of the eyeball at any moment. None of them work in isolation. Every muscle is all working at the same time together as a group. They act as a coordinated system. How the heck did that happen? Randomly, unguided. Another irreducible system. This is mechanical now in your eyes. Is this not insane? We don't talk about this stuff in high schools. We don't share this at universities. Nobody's talking about this. But it gets even worse. Okay? Correct. Blood clotting. Now we're into, in your book, we're into the discussion we had when we started this class. We were talking about death, burial, and resurrection. We're going to get into this now. But when we look at blood clotting, I am on lesson 5.3, God's irreducible complex design for life, where I go through what is the purpose of blood, right? What is blood doing? What does blood do for you? It supplies oxygen, but not to the brain. It supplies oxygen and nutrients to the cells in the body, all of them. So your blood circulation is not only taking nutrients in blood, it's taking toxins out as well. It's moving continuously. On 5.3, we go through a detailed explanation of the 3 types of cells that make up blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And the whole point is, life actually is impossible if you take blood out of a body. Right? And what you see in Deuteronomy, in Genesis actually, we'll start there on lesson 5.3. Genesis 9 verses 3 and 4. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs, but you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So God has designed blood to be life, because in it, it has all the nutrients, oxygen, everything you need for your cells. You actually are as healthy as your cells are. You think you're healthy by eating the right food and exercise. You're just making your cells healthier. That's what you're really doing. A cell we're going to look at, by the way, sorry to have to tell you this, we don't have class next week. I have to go on a business trip, and I leave early Sunday morning, so we're off next week when we get back together. Just remember that so you know. We're going to be looking at information systems, and we're going to study how a cell functions. It's a mini city. So you look at blood. God defines it in the Bible back in 1500 BC as the source of life, and scientists discovered that's exactly right. It is the source of the life of the body because it's the one that keeps your cells healthy. But there's an irreducible complex system happening with blood. It's called clotting. We talked about this one week where I asked you if you took a bucket of milk and you took a knife and you punctured it, what happens? What does the milk do?
Leaks.
Right, and it keeps leaking until you either, if I put the puncture at the bottom, all of it drains out. Now, if I take a bucket of paint and I leave the lid off, what happens?
I don't know.
It solidifies, okay? Well, how come when you cut yourself, you don't drain out like a bucket of milk?
No, it's drinking the feeling.
Okay, so how come you don't?
Clotting.
Well, how come you don't solidify like a bucket of paint and clot all inside?
Oxygen.
Let's take a look. It's a biochemical, irreducible complex process called blood clotting. Okay, you ready? We're going to talk about blood for a minute, then we're going to get into the process. But you can read it in detail in lesson 5.3. Okay, so here's your blood. Here's what it looks like. Whenever you have blood vessel damage, what happens is platelets. You have red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. Platelets will migrate to the source of clotting. First of all, how the heck do they know that? But regardless of that, they go to wherever the injury is. Then what happens is 30 proteins start acting. They don't do anything until there's a cut. For some reason, when the cut happens, an equation, a transfer function, jumps into action, much like a photon of light hitting 11 CTS retinal. If just one of the proteins we're about to look at fails, and it doesn't do its job, you bleed to death. Now you got 30 proteins. Remember what we did with the eye, this is even more. If these don't all happen together at the same time, you bleed to death like a bucket of milk. On the flip side, 8 proteins jump into action. Once fibrin, you'll see this in a minute, kind of clots up that area so that it stops the clotting. 8 of them jump into action in another equation to prevent you from becoming solidified inside. If any of those proteins don't do its job, you're like a can of paint. So there's an equation designed, a transfer function that operates to regulate this in your body. Where the heck did this come from? You ready? Okay, so here we go. So there's the damage. You've had a blood vessel cut. What happens is bound-Hegman factor jumps into action. The first thing that happens when the cut happens and platelets go there is bound-Hegman factor, a protein comes in. When that happens, it activates HMK, another protein that bonds with bound-Hegman factor, and it makes activated Hegman, another protein. When that happens, the next thing that happens is prekallikrein gets activated, and it goes and it binds to activated Hegman factor. So now you've got kallikrein. Kallikrein doesn't exist until activated Hegman factor binds with prekallikrein to form this. Now once that happens, activated Hegman factor reproduces itself. Now you get more activated Hegman factor that comes into the process, like we showed a minute ago, that starts binding with other proteins. When that happens, PTA, another protein now, comes and links with activated Hegman factor. When PTA jumps and does that, it becomes a whole new protein called activated PTA. When activated, all this has to happen now. When activated PTA now happens, more activated Hegman factor is produced. When more activated Hegman is produced because of activated PTA, what happens next is pre-convertin now comes and links with activated Hegman, a whole new protein. This doesn't happen until the previous steps happen. So when pro-convertin happens and links it, becomes convertin, a whole new protein. When convertin now is formed, guess what happens? Another protein called Christmas factor now comes and links to activated PTA, which is the one we talked about just a minute ago. When Christmas factor links with activated PTA, you get activated Christmas factor. Now you've got activated Christmas factor. When that happens, you get anti-hemophilic factor. You get a whole new protein now that's triggered because of activated Christmas factor. So now you have anti-hemophilic factor, and now another protein because anti-hemophilic factor has been activated. Now thrombin gets activated and it joins to anti-hemophilic factor. When those two join, it creates activated anti-hemophilic factor. When that protein is now activated, here comes Stewart factor. Now Stewart factor comes in and it links to activated Christmas factor to make activated anti-hemophilic factor to then bind to it and activated Christmas factor to make a whole new protein called activated Stewart factor. Now you have activated Stewart factor, which then causes tissue factor to now be activated. It comes into play, and tissue factor then comes over and links to convertin. When it links to convertin, now you have more activated Stewart factor that's produced. When more activated Stewart factor gets produced, now you have proaccelerin, another protein that then gets activated and comes into play, which only happens when you have tissue factor coming and joining to make activated Stewart factor again. Then you get proaccelerin. Proaccelerin then also causes thrombin to be activated to join to it, and that creates accelerant, another unique protein. That protein then causes GLU prothrombin, a separate protein that's been floating around in the body, in the blood system, to now be activated. When it's activated, you now get prothrombin to come link to it, to GLU. When those two link together, that causes vitamin K in the blood, another protein to come link to it to form a chain, which then makes GLA prothrombin, a completely new protein. I've gone through about 25 or 26 so far. After that happens, GLS prothrombin then gets activated. When it gets activated, calcium, it gets activated to now link to GLS, which then links to GLA to then form prothrombin calcium, a whole new protein. When that happens, it then goes links to activated Stewart factor, which then causes thrombin to then link, activate fibrinogen. Fibrinogen then linked to thrombin forms a whole new protein called fibrin. Fibrin then activates FSF. FSF, when it is activated, links to thrombin. When it's linked to thrombin, it forms activated FSF. When that happens, fibrin then links to activated FSF. When that happens, you now have your blood clot.
Wow.
This is the biochemistry of how your blood clots. All of them have to be activated and acting together. You can't be missing one. If you miss one of these, you bleed to death.
But would you say some of those are like safety features that would prevent certain conditions? Okay.
No, this is literally like the laws of physics. I
Okay.
mean, this is an equation. This equation has to be there. All of them have to be there. Or you simply can't stop bleeding.
Wow.
Is this not insane?
How long does that chemical process take?
Billionth of a second for this to happen. It happens over and over again, because what's literally happening is, I have a picture of it in the book, strands are being formed. You can't see them except under a microscope that represents the clot. That's FSF that's forming like a whole series of network, like a spider's web, that blocks and reseals it like a Band-Aid. Michael Behe's detailed discussion illustrates the impossibility of a problem that has resisted the determined efforts of top-notch scientists for 4 decades. Blood coagulation is a paradigm of staggering complexity that underlies even apparently simple bodily processes. Faced with such a complexity beneath even simple phenomena, Darwinian theory falls silent. The clotting cascade is a breathtaking balancing act in which a menagerie of biochemicals, sporting various decorations and rearrangements conferred by modifying enzymes, bounce off one another at precise angles in a meticulously ordered sequence. The audience rises to its feet in sustained applause. You know, we think of God and we go through this stuff and sometimes we think, wow, he sounds like an engineer. He could be an artist. He could be anything, right? Who knows what he's like? I mean, he can be all kinds of things. This, to me, is insane.
In a good way.
He's a good one. So, is there any wisdom literature that tells me about the design we have with blood? Every moving thing that lives is food for you. You shall not eat flesh with its life, the blood. Over and over again in the Bible, you don't find it in any other wisdom literature, talks about how important blood is. This is such cool stuff. Let's watch this video.
Irreducible complexity is a term that describes a functional object or system that cannot work without all of its parts being in their specific location and present at the same time. This means that if one part of the object or system is missing, it will not work at all. A simple illustration of an irreducible complex system is the mousetrap. Without one part of a mousetrap, such as the spring, the catch to hold down the trap bar, or the board to hold all the parts down on, the mousetrap has no beneficial function, and the mouse gets away with the cheese. I will share with you just one of many irreducibly complex biological systems that is necessary for life. This is the biological system that we take for granted every day, our blood clotting, which is called the coagulation cascade. Our blood clotting requires many complex protein molecules all in the right amount, in the right place, and all present together at the same time. Without any one part of this exact interaction, your blood would not clot, or not clot fast enough, and you would die from a small cut. On the other side of the spectrum, your blood would not stop clotting, and you would die from a massive blood clot. Here's a simplified version of our blood coagulation cascade. Blood clotting can be activated by 2 different routes called the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways. In the intrinsic pathway, all the proteins required for clotting are contained in the blood plasma. In the extrinsic pathway, some of the clotting proteins occur in cells. Now let's examine just the intrinsic pathway. When a person is cut, a protein called the Hagman factor sticks to the surface of cells near the wound. Bound Hagman factors and cleaved by a protein called HMK to yield activated Hagman factor. This activated Hagman factor converts another protein called prekallikrein to its active form, kallikrein. Now, kallikrein helps HMK speed up the conversion of more Hagman factor to its active form. Activated Hagman factor and HMK then together transform another protein called PTA to its active form. Activated PTA in turn, together with the activated form of another protein called convertin, switch a protein called Christmas factor to its active form. Next, activated Christmas factor together with antihemophilic factor, which is itself activated by thrombin in a manner similar to that of proxelin, changes Stewart factor to its active form. Stewart factor, along with accelerant, cleaves prothrombin to thrombin. Before this can happen, however, prothrombin must first be modified by having 10 specific amino acid residues called glutamate residues changed to carboxyglutamate residues. This conversion requires another protein molecule called vitamin K, which you've all heard of. And this allows the prothrombin to bind to calcium, which allows the prothrombin to stick to the surfaces of cells. Only this intact modified calcium prothrombin complex bound to a cell membrane can be cleaved by activated Stewart factor and accelerant to give thrombin. This thrombin can now cut off pieces from fibrinogen to form fibrin, which forms the sticky meshwork which traps blood cells and forms the clot. The fibrin stabilizing factor protein, which is also activated by thrombin, forms cross-linked bonds between the fibrin molecules to strengthen this plug. This highly integrated biomolecular function of blood coagulation is by definition an irreducible complex system. And just like the mousetrap, without one of these protein molecules, the system is non-functional. Each individual part by itself has no functional benefit to the organism. So you see, there's no way for natural selection to work to enable Darwinian evolution to randomly produce such a complex biological system. When we read to our children about the princess kissing the frog and turning him into a prince, we tell them that this is just a fairy tale. But our children are taught in school that when the frog is sprinkled with pixie dust for billions of years, it does turn into the prince. And they call this evolution. You see, evolution is just a fairy tale for adults.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if they taught that in school? How blood coagulation works? Okay, now the human brain. So here we are. So we've talked about the sense of sight and how it goes to the optic nerve. We talked about blood and how it coagulates. Let's think about our brain a minute. Okay, so your brain, if you're in the book and you're interested, we're now in lesson 5.4. We're looking at Psalm 139 verses 5 to 12. We've already studied Psalm 139 last week. This is the section of this piece. And we're talking about our brain. There's three major parts. Isaac Asimov, the famous atheist, said, you have a 3-pound brain, which is by far the most complex arrangement of matter in the universe. So even, no matter who you are, you look at the brain and you're blown away with how complex it is. It has three major parts. The cerebrum is voluntary actions, thinking, walking, running, sensing. It's what's in play when you're playing a sporting event, when you're reading a book. It's voluntary style. The cerebellum, though, is involuntary. It's what allows you to breathe, your posture, your coordination, your blood pressure, all these things. It's amazing. You have no control over them. You can't go ahead and say, oh, I have high blood pressure. You know what? I'm going to think about that, and I'm going to adjust my systole level and make it lower. You can't do that. Your body has an involuntary method of controlling how your heart beats and keeps your blood pressure. Your brainstem, this is more about breathing, your heartbeat. It's working all the time, and you don't even know it. I mean, you aren't even aware of this. You're not even aware of what your brainstem is doing as it's actually regulating involuntarily how you breathe and how your heart beats. All this is happening from your brain. When you think about the brain, it's actually a massive series of neurons that are constantly firing. You have over 100 trillion nerve cells in the brain. Each nerve cell is putting out anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 fibers that makes contact with other nerve cells. So you have 100 trillion nerve cells, each one putting out about 100,000 connections, connecting to all these nerve cells in this massive array that weighs 3 pounds. And with all those connections, it's extremely orderly. There's no tangling going on. Okay? Despite the enormity of the number of connections, the fibers are not chaotic. It's an organized network. The fibers are communication channels that are following their own specially ordained pathway through the brain. So literally, there are pathways in your brain for connections that are going to your optic nerve that allow you, when 11-CTS retinol is hit with a photon, so you can see. And when you're smelling and when you're hearing, this is all coordinated in this computer system of networks in your brain. So the question is, do we really believe an unguided process could create this? Do we really believe that? Let's see where I have him.
Doesn't the brain, just being able to consider itself, say something about the presence of God and our
Let's talk about that for a minute. We're going to have a whole lesson on that, but what is it about yourself that allows you to be introspective? What is that? Machines can't do that. I have yet to walk up to a copying machine at work where it's thinking about, it wishes that it could do color today or something, you know, that it can actually think about itself.
No, but if there was a machine that did that, it would be a copy machine.
Right, so how is it able, how did we go from, matter of fact, in your book, I do something as a joke, the evolution of the copy machine, where I go through the 30 different things until you got to a machine that can actually diagnose itself. Now, a machine can diagnose itself, but what can't it do?
Fix
It can't fix itself. We can, we just looked at blood clotting. So, how is it that we're introspective? Is that the brain? Is that the brain?
I'm afraid to say yes.
Right, you should be. So if we stop here, when I'm thinking, when I'm sitting here thinking about feeling guilty because I just jumped on her bones there about what she said, is there a certain electrical signal that went to my brain that processed guilt?
Sarcasm?
No, you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it. Actually, there's another neuron, yeah. So what was it that made me feel excited to give her a hard time in class? What was that?
Sarcasm.
What is it? It is immaterial. There is no program in the brain for that. So what is it?
Muscle memory?
All right, so when you're watching a cat playing with a mouse before it eats them, is the cat going, ah, this is awesome, I feel like a Taliban terrorist, and it's having a good time messing around with the mouse before it eats it? Is it sitting there enjoying doing that? Right, because I've never seen a cat that felt guilty about that and said, you know, I need to stop doing that. That's not right. I think I'm doing something wrong here. No, right? So, if we're not driven by instinct alone, what's causing us to be introspective? There's something going on called the conscience that's independent of the brain. The brain is a programmed computer that is running the entire systems of your body. The Darwinists and the evolutionists try to equate your conscience and your mind with your brain. These are two different things. They've never found any nerve synapses that make me feel guilty because I forgot flowers for Valentine's Day or something. We're going to get into that in a whole different lesson. But what you have here is my question I keep asking everyone. This is why reading the Bible is so exciting. Look what God's saying here. When he says, let us reason together, what is he saying? What do you think he's saying?
Think about this.
Yeah, right. When I'm reading a book and I'm studying something, God is saying, I want to reason with you about what you're reading and learning, right? You're using your brain. You're trying to understand the definition of platelets or what it means for blood clotting to work. And God in the Bible, throughout the Bible, keeps trying to get you to think. When Jesus Christ said, consider the lilies of the field. Now, why did he say that? Do you remember? What was he picking on us about?
Clothing.
Huh?
What we will wear.
Right, but before that he says, why do you worry? Right? Because we worry. This is, again, another annoying thing about God. It's as if you shouldn't worry. Are you kidding? I worry about what you guys think when I'm up there teaching. We worry about each other. You know, everybody worries about everything. And God's sitting there going, I don't understand why you worry. If you just consider, that word in the Greek means mentally to apprehend. It means use your mind. I want you to use your mind and think about lilies. You'll never be as beautiful as a lily. You don't have a chance. And look at them. They're gorgeous. Now, if God would do that with a lily, what about you? And we're supposed to take that information and go, he's right. I'm going to stop worrying. Why do we keep worrying? Because we're not fearless. It goes back to this. He is not in control of our lives. He does not have that level of a presence in our life. If he really did, if he lived with you in your home, if he was there, would you worry? You think we're going to worry in heaven? Gosh, I wonder what I'm going to do today. Man, this is boring. No, it's not going to happen, right? But we do today.
I
So,
think that Isaiah verse also implies a dialogue.
yes, I
Not
agree.
Not just listening. It's
Absolutely right. I agree 100%. He's saying, hey, together. Let's do this together. Let's talk about this, right? Matter of fact, when you read the prophets, what is God always doing with the prophets? There's a communication going on, right? You've got Elijah saying, well, Lord, you know, I just ran away from Jezebel and Ahab, and you know, I'm the only one left. You're sure lucky to have me, right? And God says, well, actually, Elijah, I appreciate that, but there's a lot more people out there like you, right? So he's always communicating. So let's watch Ben Carson and see what he has to say.
I mean, the human brain, the most sophisticated organ system in the universe. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers every single thing you have ever seen. Every single thing you have ever heard. Can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. I mean, it is unbelievable. Some people say, well, you shouldn't learn this, you shouldn't learn this because you'll overload your brain. Have you ever heard anybody say that? What a bunch of nonsense that is. Do you know your brain, and this is a conservative estimate, could take in 1 new fact every second for over 3 million years before you begin to challenge its capacity. So don't let anybody tell you that you can overload your brain. And that's our brains in their degenerated state. Can you imagine what they were like before? Unbelievable. Because we're made in the image of God. How many people here remember your birthday? Okay, I think it's unanimous. What did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the over and round with a set of vibratory force in the end of them, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, sitting bilaterally at the brainstem to the lateral meniscus to the inferior colliculus, and the medial geniculate nuclei across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes, beginning auditory process. From there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor-Jour, retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure of the memory body back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bed cell level, coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decusation, into the spinal cord gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle. So you can raise your hand. And that's the simplified version of what your brain has to see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But you know, but if your brain can do that and you barely even had to think about it, what is your brain capable of if you actually put your mind to something? And someone wants to tell me that that came from a slime pit with a bunch of promiscuous biochemicals? Give me a break. You know, that really stretches the limits of credulity.
Is that not cool?
Mm-hmm.
Just think about that. We take all this for granted every day, right? Okay, so when we think about sensing, how your different parts of your body sense things and then translate it into signals for your brain to think. Think of your body. You've got your brain, the control center, computer that receives, computes, and sends billions of pieces of information throughout your body that controls your movement and activity. We just looked at Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. Come, let us reason together. Your optic nerve for sight, the eye's retina processes light photons into electrical signals. The electrical signals travel to the brain where I see. If you go to Exodus 3:7, what's happening is God is constantly describing himself in what they call anthropomorphic terms, which means ways that we can understand as humans. So he talks about himself as seeing things. He's designed us, when he says he designed us in his image, it includes physical. Our brain functions by the optic nerve for sight. Then we have the olfactory nerve for smell. The nose's nerve cells process odor molecules of the olfactory bulb. The electrical signals from those bulbs go to the brain so you can smell. You'll see over and over again in the Pentateuch where God says he smells the aroma from the sacrifice that people make as a soothing aroma that pleases him. He's not a guy sitting there going, wow, that smells good. He's doing that so we can understand.
Oh, I thought he liked barbecue.
Yes, hopefully that's why he likes Kansas City. That's why we're special. Then we have the auditory nerve from the ear. The ear processes sound waves into mechanical vibrations. Those hair cells convert vibrations into electrical impulses, travel to the brain, so I can hear. You have taste buds. They process chemicals that they turn into electrical signals that travel to the brain so I can taste things. You have your entire skin. It's one big organ. Your skin is an organ where all the nerve cells there are then transferred into electrical signals to the spinal cord so you can feel. So when people talk about feelings, this is real feel. This is the real deal. So you have all this together in one system as a machine so that you can function all coming through one organ processing your brain. I think this is the coolest thing going. I mean, when you just look at who you are. Is there any wisdom literature that talks about how your sensory system is actually designed by God to be like him? This is why when you look at those verses and God talks about he smells, he tastes, he feels, he's doing that because he designed you to be that image of him in real life. Smelling, feeling, hearing, those are all designed so you can relate to him better, especially as you study your Bible. You see how real he is. That's why he does it. Okay, so we've been through this chart before. This is our last slide here as we end, where we've laid out, we started with particles as we studied the universe and the forces. We've been moving up through the different pieces. We're going to get into information next time. We went all the way up looking at the universe and how it operates, right? So you have this incredible array from the smallest thing to the biggest, where throughout the entire spectrum you see design. Here we looked at just today the hearing eye, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made both. That's in Proverbs. You have blood clotting. The blood is the life. You may not eat the life with the meat. You have the brain. Counsel is mine and sound wisdom. I have understanding. Throughout the Bible, you're going to find this over and over again. God talking about your ability to understand and process information. Werner von Braun, he was actually the first rocket scientist. He left, if you study him, he's really interesting. He's a Christian. When Hitler came into play in Germany is when he left, defected Germany and came to the U.S. He said to be forced to believe only one conclusion, that everything in the universe happened by chance, would violate the objectivity of science itself. What random process could produce the brains of a man or the system of the human eye? And you have DNA we're going to be studying. Psalm 100 verse 3, know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us and not we ourselves. What is our culture saying today? We are in charge of everything. We decide our own destiny. We can do anything we want. God said, no, you can't, not really. I'm the one who designed you. And when you study science, I'm sorry, you study science, it links up with exactly what the Bible teaches. It's really silly to be an atheist. You just
Sure is.
To be an atheist, you really have to check yourself and your logic at the door.
Yeah.
Make sense? Anybody? We still got a couple minutes. Any questions? Any comments on this? Is this make sense to you guys? It's not very exciting, is it? It's just, more information. What are you going to do with it, right? You could good. All of these are on little videos on the website, so if you ever run into people that say things or you think would be worthwhile, point into a lesson and say, do me a favor, watch this. I'd really like to know why you think that way.
But one thing real quick, if people can share this information that you have out there on the lessons, or what, simply sharing one little thing is giving testimony to what the Lord has done. So if you feel like you don't have time to share your testimony with somebody or share the gospel, all you have to do is go to find one of these things you find interesting and say, hey, send this to them and say, what do you think of this? Start a conversation. It's that easy. That's why this is all out there, so you can share it.
Yep, because this is what's happening in our universities. They're taking information, twisting it the way they want it, teaching our young people, and pretty soon we have people coming out of universities that end up like the New York mayor, who says that he's going to have a meatless Thursday for all the high schools in New York City. They're going to enact it next year, this September actually, in schools. You know why he's doing it? You know me? To help reduce cow flatulence to affect climate change. This is going to be New York City's part in helping.
Yeah. Not to mention the leather seats in all your vehicles.
I just want you to absorb what's going on right now, okay? These are the products of our universities, guys. The information we're talking about here is factual. So we're not teaching this, and instead we're teaching this other stuff. All right, let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you, Lord.